Hi guys, I am Mrs. Sloan and welcome to Chapter 33. Chapter 33 is going to be all about population ecology. So I'm going to break the video down or this lesson into two videos. The first video that you're watching right now is going to define ecology, as well as we're going to talk about the patterns of population growth. Video number 2 for chapter 33, we're going to focus on the regulation of population growth. Now, in the descriptor of this video down below, you will see a link to a Google document, which is how you will take notes on this video. Now, when you open up that document, you will see that there are two columns. Column number 1 is the content scaffolding. And as I go through this presentation, you'll see blanks in the scaffolding. It'll be highlighted in yellow. And what you're going to want to do is finish up the topic, the sentence, the word that's needed in that blank, and I'll be telling you what those are as we go through them, all right? Column number 2 is empty. You're going to populate that column with a picture, an image, a review, something that helps you to remember that particular topic. Now, in my class, if you're not familiar with this, we do what's called group shared notes. So we usually take our notes collectively with 2 or 3 friends in the classroom. Now, we're starting off this year remote, so it'll be a little bit different, but you can still do group shared notes where you do them with a friend. So you could both be watching the video at the same time and populating the notes at the same time. Somebody could focus on typing in the words. Somebody else could be putting in pictures into that second column. So you have a really nice set of notes to use as a reference and a study guide. All right, so you're going to want to click on that link for the notes and make a copy. And if you're going to work on it with a friend, you want to share that with a friend and give them editing rights as well. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller over here, and I'm going to go ahead and put us in presentation mode. All right, so chapter 33, population growth and regulation. So the first thing we want to do is to define ecology, and that's the first bit that you need to put on your notes. You can see on your notes it just says ecology defined, and then it's blank. So here's how you fill in that blank. Ecology is defined as the study of interactions of organisms with other organisms and their physical environment. All right, so different organisms interacting with each other and with their physical environment. So when you talk about an organism in its environment, a habitat is where it lives. So when you're looking at this woodland area, you know that if for some reason this water gets polluted, it's going to affect all the organisms within that particular area, right? So everything is interdependent on each other. So that's the first thing you want to kind of get in your head. Let me show you another. When we talk about the levels, when we go through, now where all living things exist, right? Whether it's air, land, or water, that is called the biosphere. But let's bring ourselves up. So you look at this one caribou, that's an individual. When you have groups of caribou together, when you're just looking at caribou, that's a population. A group of interbreeding caribou would be a population. When you look at how the caribou might interact with the beavers and the owls and the moose, then you're looking at communities. So those are several different populations interacting together. Now, when you take in consideration the temperature, the pH of the soil, weather conditions, climate, then you're looking at an ecosystem. And this is the jumping off point here for ecology, right? We're looking at how organisms interact with each other and their environment. Then you have regions that are similar, and those are called biomes. Like you could have a tropical forest biome, a coniferous forest, a desert. Those are all biomes where they have similar climate and flora and fauna. And then where all living things exist is the biosphere. So as far as organization goes, on your notes, you have levels, and you have probably just one word there is organism. And then several of the same organism, you want to write population, and then community, and then ecosystem, And then you want to put, you can put biome and then biosphere. And that's where all living things exist. Now, if you need a little more time, just pause the video before you go any further. All right. So here in this diagram, this is showing you the whole biosphere. So we just need to remember that organisms will live in all of these areas and they will play different roles and they will impact one another. Now, who impacts the environment very rapidly and sometimes negatively would be humans, right? We can change an environment immediately. We can go to a forest, plow it down, change the entire ecosystem and all the organisms in there, and they don't have time to adapt. So when we talk about ecology, we have to look at man's impact on those ecosystems as well as other organisms, all right? So this would be a 33.2 if you look in your notes. So this is patterns of population growth, and we're going to do a POGL that relates to this and gives you practice for this as well. So the first thing we want to look at is the rate of increase, like how fast a population is growing. So you can, to figure that out, you just take how many organisms are born minus how many die over the total population, and that will give you the rate of increase. Now, some organisms reproduce very, very quickly, some a little bit slower. Some have thousands of offspring, some have one or two. So when we look at that, okay, you're referring to an organism's biotic potential, right? And that's going to vary for every single organism. So for instance, humans usually give birth to how many? One, right? Occasionally you might have two. A good sign, if you're looking at mammals, is how many nipples they have, right? We weren't built to give birth to 6 babies because we don't have 6 nipples. We have 2, right? So organisms are adapted for a certain number of offspring each time they reproduce, and we'll go into some more details about that. So if you look at your notes on growth rate, hopefully you added in births minus deaths over total population. You did that from the last slide. And we're moving into biotic potential, which is the highest possible growth rate, and it is dependent upon 4 factors. So let's go through those factors. All right, I know that's a creepy baby picture on the top. Sorry about that. So the first one we want to look at is the age of first reproduction. So age of first reproduction. So how soon do you start generating more offspring? Now, technically, by the time you go through puberty at whatever age that is, 12, 13, 14, you could start making more offspring, right? Some organisms, butterflies, literally they're coming out of the cocoon and they immediately start reproducing. So when is the first time you reproduce? At what age? This is how you determine biotic potential. Number 2, the average number of offspring per reproduction. So when do you start and how many do you make? Number 3 is how often you reproduce. Do you reproduce every 6 months, every 2 years, once and done? How often do you do that? And then number 4, what is the chances of survival and to the age of reproduction? Like, are you likely to survive and reproduce? Let me give an example for that. So you have seeds, right? Not all seeds are going to be able to find the right soil, the right conditions, the right amount of water, the right amount of sunlight to generate. So they would have a very small percentage that will reach the age of survival until they can reproduce. All right, so hopefully you filled in your notes: age of first reproduction, average number of offspring, how often each individual reproduces, and chances of survival until age of reproduction. So then that brings us to kind of looking at the 2 types of growth curves. And I'm going to introduce it now. We're going to revisit it later. So exponential growth curves versus logistic growth curves. So exponential sounds just like it looks, right? Very rapid reproduction. They call that a J-shaped growth curve. For this, you're seeing here, let me get a pointer. You can see it right here. You can see that J shape in blue. Okay, that's exponential growth. And then logistic growth is the S shape. That would be the red. Now, I want to point out to you, or let me just pose this question. When you look at those 2 graphs, do they have anything in common? Okay, hopefully you can see at the beginning right here, it is very similar, right? There's some lag time, and then they both start off exponentially, but then the logistic growth curve starts to slow down. It's going to have some environmental resistance that slows it down, and we will be talking through those. So let's focus on the J-shaped growth curve. So these types of organisms that have this exponential growth, they tend to be very, very small. They reproduce very, very early. They don't tend to care for their offspring. They are kind of eat and drink for tomorrow we may die kind of philosophy. And for it to continue in that way, it would have to have unlimited resources, which it probably doesn't. So you tend to see a crash and burn after they have reproduced quite a few offspring. So on your notes, you have J-shaped, and I gave you an example, insects. And so they have exponential growth, which means they have no limitations. Nothing is pushing back on that. The phases, you can see at the beginning, the lag, and then it goes into the exponential, and it will eventually crash. It's going to crash and burn because it can't be maintained. Whereas if you look at a logistic growth curve, okay, and you can see the exponential ones here in blue, and then you can see this light blue area right there. This is the pushing back. There's not enough food. There are not enough places to hide. There are not enough mates to reproduce with. So you have something in the environment that is pushing back that environmental resistance. And then they tend to hover at what's called the carrying capacity. So if I could draw a straight line across here, that would be the carrying capacity. For instance, if there's an area, let's say in Oak Park, there's only so many nesting sites, let's say for hawks. So whatever that is right around Oak Park, let's say there is enough to support 40 hawks to be in the general area, 20 nesting pairs. Then sometimes you might go a little above, but because there aren't enough nesting sites, some are going to die off, and sometimes you might go a little below, and then it's going to come back right about at that carrying capacity. So on your notes for S-shaped, I gave you an example like an elephant. You have logistic growth. Population levels out because it is limited by environmental resistance. That's what goes in your notes, environmental resistance. The phases, you still have the lag phase right here, and you do go into the exponential phase, but then you tend to slow down and stabilize at the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is defined, and you have it right there on your screen too, as the number of individuals of a species that can be supported by the environment. The number of individuals of a species that can be supported by an environment. All right. So in your mind right now, okay, you want to kind of think back what we talked about. We talked about growth rates, right? So we said number of births minus number of deaths over the total population. That's going to give you your rate of growth. Okay. Second item we've talked about are the two types of growth curves. So we talked about, maximizing highest rate of biotic potential, which will eventually end in a crash and burn. And we talked about the logistic growth model, which stabilizes out at the carrying capacity. All right. So now let's bring in one other way to describe population growth. Oh, sorry, forgot about this guy. Here's an example of environmental resistance, is habitat loss, right? Not having an area, just like we talked about a little bit earlier. Not having an area to live. Habitat, remember, is where you're living. Okay, and when we study populations, you can talk about a cohort, and that's all the members of the population that are born at that time, and then together they're going to be going through the different life stages, right? So for instance, if you're in 10th grade right now, you are in a cohort of 10th graders. Next year you will be in 11th grade, then 12th grade, and you will all be entering college probably about the same time. That is your cohort. So when you study them, you want to talk about survivorship. What is the probability of the newborn individuals surviving to particular ages? Remember when we talked about the biotic potential, one of the factors we talked about is, will you survive in order to reproduce? So in order to analyze that, there are survivorship curves. So there's type 1, type 2, and type 3. Okay, type 1 is what you fall in as a human, that if you are born, you are likely to survive and reproduce and just die at the end of your lifespan of old age. The opposite of type 1 is type 3, like I was talking about with plants with you, that most of the seeds will not find an area where they can grow and develop. And so their numbers drop off drastically and only a few survive to reproduce. And then somewhere in between is type 2, where you're dying, not necessarily, let's say you're a bird, you're not dying because you're old or you couldn't find a place to survive, but let's say you flew into a window and that killed you, right? So it wasn't a factor of your age. So let's break those down in a little more detail. And on your notes, let's start with type 1 survivorship. So, and let me help you with your notes. On survivorship curves, for a cohort, they are all the members of a population born at the same time. Born at the same time. All right. So type 1, most individuals live out their lifespan and die of old age. So this is typical of large mammals like these elephants, large mammals, and humans. Right? So that's type 1. I want you to note, if you ever had to analyze like for a test, notice these survivorship curves always start right up here with 1,000. So they're all starting at the same point and they will all end at the same point. It's just how do they get there, right? Okay, so next let's talk about a type 2 survivorship curve. Look where we are. We start at 1,000. We end here, your percentage of your lifespan. It's how we're going about getting there, right? The numbers. So for type 2, individuals die at a constant rate across their lifespan. This is typical of birds and rodents. Birds and rodents. And then type 3 survivorship curves, most individuals die early in life. Most individuals die early in life, like fish and invertebrates and plants. Okay, fish, invertebrates, and plants. Now, I'm going to go back just to simplify this. I'm going to go back to this simple, like cartoony diagram and then talk to you here for a minute. Okay, so from what we talked about earlier, and we talked about the 2 different types of growth curves, what survivorship curve would you pair up with the growth curves? Survivorship with growth curves. Remember, there were the 2 growth curves, right? The J-shaped exponential and the S-shaped logistical. So think about it. Look at your different types. Okay, do you have an idea? Right? So large mammals, humans like us, were more of those S-shaped growth curve. We're the type 1 survivorship, right? We last all the way out in our lifetime. Whereas if you look at the J-shaped growth curve, that is more associated with the type 3 survivorship curve. So it's just 2 different strategies. Fewer offspring, more investment, right, in the logistic growth curve. Whereas in the J-shaped growth curve, you're investing in the sheer numbers of offspring because you know that not very many are actually going to survive to the age of reproduction. So these are just different strategies that living organisms employ. Okay. All right. So now let's move on specifically to, let me move through here. Okay. And here's another one to show you. Okay. Is to look at the human population. All right. So depending on where you live, you could be, if you're like in New York City, right? They have if you look at the density of humans per the area, right? It's very, very dense, but you could be in Montana and there's fewer numbers of individuals per any one area. So that is one way to look at it by location for sure. When we look at human population over time, it was very, very constant. And then there was this exponential growth rate. And you can see, I kind of like this because it shows you the plague right here and where the numbers dipped off. I'm worried about, I'm thinking about COVID right now and thinking about studying how that's going to influence our population growth. So there is a video, and I'll put a link to this video. I know it looks creepy here, but it really works to understand human population growth and how it is in different countries. And some people get worried that we're just going to overpopulate everywhere. But what the studies show is, as we increase education, as we increase medicine, that it actually slows the population growth down as you're transitioning as a population to have an increased rate of survival. So this is a great video, and I'm going to give you that as a link so you can watch that on your own time. All right, so when we look at less developed countries versus more developed countries, you will look on the more developed countries right here. You can see that the population is at a steady state. Whereas you can see these exponential growth curves in those less developed countries. And what helps transition them from exponential growth to a more steady state are things like education and medicine and ability to acquire food. So anything we can do to help in those areas in less developed countries is going to help to curb that population increase. All right, so on your notes on variations, less developed countries, and I gave you some examples of some less developed countries, they are still in the exponential phase of growth, and by and large, the majority live in poverty, or what we would call poverty standards. Okay, in more developed countries, and I gave you some examples there, the growth is leveled off, and people generally enjoy a good standard of living. So next, that takes us to the world population and how fast it's currently growing. Right now, per day, about 216,000 people are added to this world. And the population doubling time right now, it's currently at about every 56 years, the population is doubling. So on doubling time, it's the time it takes for the population to double in size, and it's currently about 56 years. So zero population growth would be, I know this is creepy, sorry. Zero population growth would be when the birth rate equals the death rate. So the birth rate equals the death rate, that's when you have zero population growth. So strategies to get to zero population growth, and you could ask yourself, why would that be important to get to zero population growth? And that's because we have a finite number of resources on this planet, right? And so energy flows and nutrient cycle, we only have so many. And so when you think about carrying capacity, right? How many people can this earth maintain with the resources it has? That's something we need to be considerate of, yes? So strategies to reduce growth rate are things like strengthening family planning, using social progress to reduce the desire for large families. I gave you all of those. Education for women, reducing child mortality rates is huge, and delay of onset of childbearing. So I gave you those in the notes already. So when we analyze human populations, you can look at more developed versus less developed countries. And so don't be all proud of yourself if you're a more developed country. When you look at the population on this planet, we only represent 22% of the planet. Yet we generate 90% of the hazardous waste production. Where are those hazardous wastes going to go? There's no walls to prevent them from going over our entire biosphere, right? That we are all interconnected, all the land, all the water. And so this small percentage of the world's population is generating a large percentage of hazardous waste. And so we need to be aware of that and do all that we can not to produce that. When you look at consumption of fossil fuels, though we represent, remember, just 22% of the world's population, we consume 60% of the fossil fuels, 80% of the metal consumption, and 75% of the paper production. So this is why we need to understand when we look at those ecosystems, remember, we look at ecology is organisms interacting with each other and with the environment. We as humans have the largest impact on the environment in the shortest amount of time, and we need to be aware of that. Not if you're like, I don't really care about the owls in Oregon. It's fine, but those are eventually, it's going to impact you. If you want to think about it from a very selfish point of view, eventually it's going to impact the air that you breathe, the food that you want to consume. I think this time of COVID has shown us one thing, is how interconnected we are as a world. There's no borders, there's nothing to separate us. And this pathogen, this virus, was able to travel all the way around the world and impact all of us, our livelihood, and our health. All right. Next, when you look at age structure diagrams, all right, this one looks like a pyramid, and you can see it's broken into 3 groups: pre-reproductive, okay, before you're making more offspring, reproductive age, and post-reproductive age. Now, based on this, you can see there's a large number in the pre-reproductive, and that large number is all going to transition into the reproductive age, which will generate an even bigger base, and then again another larger base, and so on and so on. And this is what you would see in the less developed countries with exponential growth. Now, in more developed countries, remember, we're like hovering at that carrying capacity. We're hovering closer to zero population growth. You can see it is a little bit more stable. The number that are entering into the reproductive age is about the same every single year, so it helps to stabilize population growth. So when you look at your age structure diagrams, there are 3 groups: pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. So women entering reproductive years versus leaving the reproductive years. In LDCs, you have more women entering, right? More women entering from pre-reproductive to reproductive. You have that pyramid shape, and you have continued growth. It's a very unstable age structure diagram. Whereas you look in more developed countries, it's more of a column shape, and you have a stable age structure diagram. All right, so the next part I'm going to save for video number 2, and we will look at the regulation of population growth. All right, that's all.